I was 42 when my father died, though the weight of being the family caretaker had aged me well beyond my years. I had spent the last decade living in my childhood home in Meadowbrook, a small town where everyone knew your name but few knew your struggles. My brother James lived in Seattle with his perfect wife, perfect children, and perfect excuse for why he could never visit. Meanwhile, I remained frozen in time, tending to our parents as their health slowly declined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never married, never had children. There was David once, a kind architect with plans for us to move to Chicago. But I asked him to wait when Mom first got sick. He waited 8 months. I waited too long. He married a dental hygienist with a warm smile. I sent them a card that simply read, wishing you happiness. Sarah, that was 15 years ago. James called me the smart one during his brief visits, which happened once every couple of years, usually with expensive gifts and stories of his successful life that seemed designed to remind us all of what I had given up. Dad called me his rock. But James was the one who carried the family name forward. I never quite understood what that meant until later. Maybe it was the grandchildren. Maybe it was his executive job that paid for first-class flights. Maybe it was the way Dad's eyes lit up when James walked through the door, as if his mere presence could heal the pain in his arthritic joints. I was the one who drove Dad to doctor appointments, who learned how to check his blood pressure, who organized his medications in daily pill boxes. I was the one who woke in the middle of the night when he called out in pain. The one who prepared special meals when his appetite faded. I worked part-time at the local museum, giving tours to schoolchildren about history I once dreamed of studying professionally. I had a master's degree in history and a half-written application for a PhD program I abandoned 12 years ago, but I stayed because someone had to. Dad once told me I was fortunate. "You're not like James," he said one evening while I helped him with his breathing exercises. "You don't have the burden of providing for a family. So staying here makes sense for you, doesn't it?" He didn't mean to be cruel. Or maybe he did. It's hard to tell with parents sometimes. James called once during a particularly difficult week to ask why I hadn't pursued my own life. I gently reminded him that he had refused to take Mom for even a weekend when Dad needed heart surgery. He paused, then said, "Well, I have 3 kids and a department to run, Sarah. That's not exactly a vacation." I forced a laugh because that was what I had learned to do when someone dismissed my sacrifices. Laugh. Let it go. Be the dependable one. I didn't envy James. Not exactly. But sometimes when I was alone, paying bills at the kitchen table or sorting through medical records, I wondered what it might have felt like to be encouraged to leave, to be the one whose absence was accepted rather than resented. Instead, I made appointment reminders. I refilled prescriptions. I learned to communicate with insurance companies as if it were a second language. I cleared out Dad's workshop after his stroke, finding old journals he'd kept about family vacations, written in handwriting that was now too steady for his trembling hands to replicate. At church, people patted my shoulder and said I was a blessing. "Your parents are so lucky to have you." I smiled. I always smiled. But I can't remember the last time anyone asked what I wanted for my own life. By the time Dad's health took its final decline, I had been living in this holding pattern for so long that I had forgotten there might be alternatives. And when David's name occasionally came up in conversation, always mentioned by someone else, never me, I simply nodded. That version of Sarah belonged to another lifetime, one where choices existed beyond which hospital to visit. My father passed on a Thursday morning. It was sunny, almost inappropriately bright for such a somber day. I held his hand until the warmth left it. His final breath was quiet, peaceful. Mom was asleep in the recliner beside the bed. James was on a flight he'd booked at the last minute, saying he couldn't get away from an important client meeting any sooner. He arrived that evening, still wearing his tailored suit, pulling an expensive leather suitcase through the front door with an air of importance. The funeral was modest, attended by neighbors, church members, and Dad's old colleagues from the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 40 years. James delivered a eulogy that mentioned Dad's love of baseball and fishing trips that I didn't remember him taking. I read a passage from Dad's favorite book. No one asked me to speak, but the minister nodded slightly when I approached the podium. James stayed 3 nights. He offered to handle the funeral expenses, then remembered he'd left his checkbook at home. I didn't remind him. On the 3rd evening, I found him on his laptop booking a flight for Saturday morning, explaining he had to get back because his oldest had a debate tournament and Caroline couldn't manage the household alone. I packed Dad's clothes into donation boxes, carefully folded his favorite sweater to keep for myself, and removed the fishing trophies from the den shelves. Mom moved through the house like a ghost, touching objects as if to confirm they were still real. 3 weeks later, we received a letter from Mr. Bennett, Dad's attorney, requesting our presence at his office to discuss the will. It was a Monday afternoon. James flew in that morning wearing an expensive watch and carrying a briefcase that seemed unnecessary for the occasion. Mr. Bennett had kind eyes and a voice that conveyed he'd delivered both good and bad news many times before. He opened a folder and began reading with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of legal words. The house, Dad's pension, the savings account, and even the vintage car Dad had restored years ago, everything was to be transferred to James and his children. Mr. Bennett read their names aloud: Michael, Elizabeth, and Thomas. Each name felt like a small wound. My name never appeared, not once throughout the entire document. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat perfectly still, focusing on the framed law degree on the wall rather than the growing knot in my stomach. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I felt like I was watching this scene from somewhere outside my body. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat several times as the list of assets continued. Mr. Bennett paused, looked at me with something like apology in his eyes, then turned to my mother. Mom smiled, not with kindness but with satisfaction. She placed her hand on mine in a gesture that appeared caring to anyone watching but felt cold against my skin. "You don't need anything, Sarah," she said with a dismissive wave. "You've lived in our house all these years for free. That was your inheritance." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because the alternative was to scream in a quiet office where professionals spoke in hushed tones. Outside, children were playing in the park. Across the street, their laughter floated through the window, so disconnected from what was happening in this room that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't question or argue. I just stared at the passing landmarks of a town I'd never left, wondering how something could feel both completely shocking and utterly predictable at the same time. That evening, I made a list of what belonged to me. It was surprisingly short. By morning, I had packed 2 suitcases and a box of books that had always been mine. I also took the wooden music box Dad had given me on my 16th birthday. It played Beethoven's Für Elise and had my name carved on the bottom, Sarah, in careful letters. He had given it to me after I won a history competition at school. "For your memories," he'd said. "The important ones." I left a brief note on the kitchen counter. "Mom, I'm going to Colorado. I'll contact you when I'm settled." I never did. I found a small town in the mountains where no one knew my history and rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a bookstore. The rent was reasonable. The view was breathtaking. The silence was my own. I got a job at the local historical society, cataloging artifacts, giving tours, helping researchers navigate the archives. Nothing prestigious, but it connected me to the passion I'd abandoned years ago. No one there knew my story. I was just Sarah. Not the dutiful daughter, not the family disappointment, not the woman who sacrificed her future for people who never noticed. I didn't take any family photos, no heirlooms, nothing to connect me to the past. But I kept the music box on my nightstand. Some evenings I would open it just to hear the melody, to remind myself that there had been moments when someone saw me as more than just a caretaker. I ate dinner at a small cafe most nights. I joined a hiking group on weekends. I found peace in the rhythm of days that weren't punctuated by medical emergencies or guilt-laden phone calls. When people asked about my family, I said, "We're not close," and changed the subject. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel victimized. I just felt free. They hadn't taken my inheritance. They had taken the illusion that family meant unconditional support, and somehow that revelation was worth more than any property could have been. The envelope arrived 6 months later, delivered to my workplace since I hadn't left a forwarding address with the postal service. It was a standard business envelope with my name typed on the front. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. Unopened. Inside was a letter from Mr. Bennett, the attorney. His handwriting was precise, almost apologetic. "Sarah, I was not at liberty to disclose this during the reading, but I believe you should know. Your father came to see me privately 8 months before his passing. He left something specifically for you, with instructions that it be delivered after everything else was settled. I've enclosed the second envelope he left in my care." I stared at the smaller envelope that had fallen onto my desk. It was sealed with wax, old-fashioned and deliberate, the way Dad had always done important documents. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a key and a handwritten note in Dad's unsteady handwriting, the letters shaky but determined. "Sarah, by now you know about the will. Your mother insisted on the arrangements. I was too weak to fight by then. But this key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 247. What's inside has always been meant for you alone. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger when it mattered. I sat at my desk long after my coworkers had left for the day. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room. Outside, tourists wandered the streets, taking photos of the mountains, laughing, living their normal lives. A dog barked in the distance. The world continued. As if nothing had shifted, though everything had. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The manager led me to a private room after I showed identification and the key. The safety deposit box was larger than I expected. Inside was a manila envelope and a small wooden case. I opened the envelope. First. It contained stock certificates, bonds, and bank statements for an account I never knew existed. The note attached was brief: I saved what I could without her knowing. Started when you were born. It's not everything you deserve, but it's something that is yours alone. The total value was close to $300,000. I stared at the figures, trying to process what they meant, what they represented. The wooden case held my grandmother's emerald ring, the one Mom had always claimed was lost decades ago. Another note: this was meant for you. She took it. I found it hidden in her jewelry box last year. I slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years. I was 24 when I received the letter of acceptance. From the University of Chicago. Full scholarship for their PhD program in American history. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, with the university seal embossed in the corner. I remember holding it to my chest, spinning around my bedroom, imagining lecture halls and research libraries and a life dedicated to uncovering the past. That night at dinner, I placed the letter beside Dad's plate. He picked it up, read it. Slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "My brilliant girl," he said, his voice filled with pride. Then Mom took the letter, scanned it quickly, and set it down with a dismissive tap of her fingers. "Chicago is too far," she said, serving potatoes. "Besides, I'm having those tests next month. The doctor says I'll need someone to drive me to appointments." She didn't look at me as she spoke, as if the matter was already settled. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it, his moment of pride evaporating into the silence that ruled our home. "It's a full scholarship," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I could come back for breaks. For important appointments." Mom laughed, not cruelly, but with the confidence of someone who knew they would win. "James is too busy. With his new job. Your father can barely drive at night anymore. Who would take care of things here?" Dad stared at his plate. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say something, anything, that would give me permission to choose myself just this once. He didn't. The letter sat on the table between us, a bridge to another life that no one would let me cross. Later that night, I heard them arguing, their voices carrying through the heating vent between our rooms. Dad's voice, unusually firm. "She deserves this chance, Margaret." Mom's response, cold and final: "And who deserves to be abandoned? Us? After everything we've done?" The next morning, the acceptance letter was gone from the table. I never asked where it went. That memory had been buried for so long, but sitting in the bank with my father's secret gift spread before me, it surfaced with perfect clarity. He had been silent when it mattered most, but he had been saving for me all along, building a future in secret that he couldn't give me openly. It had been almost a year of peaceful silence when James finally tracked down my number. I was cataloging a collection of mining artifacts when my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar area code. I almost didn't answer. His voice sounded older, strained. "Sarah, it's Mom. She's not doing well. The doctors say it might be Alzheimer's. Early stages." I didn't respond immediately. James filled the silence with words. "She's forgetting things. Names, faces. She put her keys in the refrigerator yesterday. I can't keep flying back and forth. Caroline is losing patience. The kids hardly know her." Another pause. "She asks for you. Not me. You." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice steady and distant. James sighed heavily. "That's it? Sorry to hear that? After everything? That's all you have to say?" I closed my eyes, pictured the museum around me, the life I had built, the peace I had found. "What would you like me to say, James?" "She's our mother," he said, as if that explained everything, erased everything. "She needs someone to care for her. The house is just sitting there. You could move back. It makes sense." I almost laughed. At the familiar phrase. "It makes sense for you. It always did." "The house belongs to you now," I reminded him. "Sell it. Use the money for a care facility." James made a frustrated sound. "You know she would hate that. She wants to be in her home. With family." I ran my finger along the edge of my desk, feeling each groove and imperfection in the wood. "Then perhaps you should move back. It makes sense, doesn't it?" The line went quiet. Then, I have responsibilities here, Sarah. A career. A family. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Yes. And now you have one more. Goodbye, James. I hung up before he could respond. That evening, I opened my father's music box and listened to the familiar melody. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt like someone who had finally learned that some debts can never be repaid because they should never have been created. 2 days later, I received a text from our old neighbor, Mrs. Callahan. I visit your mother on Tuesdays. She cries when I leave. Keeps asking where you went. Thought you should know. I stared at the message, feeling a familiar pull, the gravitational force of obligation that had defined my life for so long. I set the phone down without responding. That night, I made tea and sat by the window overlooking the mountains. I placed Dad's letter on the table beside the emerald ring and the bank statements. I didn't light a candle or create any ceremony. I just sat with the truth of what my life had been and what it could be now. There had been a time when I would have packed immediately. No questions asked, no boundaries set. I would have returned to that house, cleaned the rooms, managed the medications, cooked the meals, and disappeared back into the role of the dutiful daughter. I would have done it because that's what I had been taught good daughters do. But I wasn't that daughter anymore. Not in the ways that mattered. I was the one who stayed when it was inconvenient, the one who gave up dreams, the one who was invisible until needed. And I was done. I didn't call James back. I didn't respond to Mrs. Callahan. I put my phone on silent and let the evening settle around me like a comfortable blanket. The next morning, I woke to sunshine and mountain air. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't start my day wondering about someone else's medication schedule or doctor appointments. I enrolled in an online history program, using some of Dad's secret fund for tuition. I joined a writing group at the local library. I planted herbs on my balcony, basil, mint, rosemary, and watched them grow in the summer sun. I changed my email address, got a new phone number. I didn't tell James. I didn't provide updated contact information to anyone from my hometown. I let that chapter close naturally, like a book that had reached its final page. The silence that followed wasn't heavy with guilt. It was light, peaceful, the kind of quiet that heals rather than hurts. I still kept the music box, still played it sometimes in the evening. Not to remember the pain, but to honor the small ways my father had tried to see me, even when he couldn't stand up for me. I hung a single photo on my wall, not a family portrait, but a picture of the mountains taken on my first hiking trip after moving to Colorado. It represented not where I came from, but where I had chosen to go. Sometimes I wondered what happened to the house, if James had sold it or kept it, if Mom still lived there or had been moved to a facility. I never checked. I didn't know them. That curiosity. For the first time in 42 years, I wasn't measuring my worth by my usefulness to others. I stopped apologizing for choosing myself. I stopped believing that love required self-erasure. I still had the emerald ring, still wore it on special occasions, but I no longer needed physical reminders to feel worthy. But in doing so, they had freed me to write my own story. Not one of bitterness or revenge, but one of quiet self-discovery and peace. Dad's secret gift hadn't just been the money or the ring. It had been permission, too late, too little. But still real, to believe that I deserved more than I had been given. His second envelope hadn't changed the past, but it had confirmed what I had always suspected: sometimes silence doesn't mean agreement. Sometimes it just means someone isn't strong enough to fight for you, even when they want to. And that was enough, not to forgive, exactly, but to understand. To move forward without the weight of questions I couldn't answer. To build something new from the fragments of what had been taken. Not because I had won, but because I had finally learned. To walk away. And in that walking away, I had found something I never expected: myself. After a year in Colorado, I began to feel something unfamiliar: possibility. Not just the freedom from obligation, but the quiet thrill of choice. I could decide to take a weekend trip without checking if someone needed medication. I could stay late at work without rushing home to prepare dinner for anyone but myself. Small freedoms that most people take for granted had become luxuries I savored. I had been using Dad's gift to create a new life, slowly and deliberately. I bought a small cabin on the edge of town with a view of the mountains. Nothing extravagant, just a place with wooden floors, large windows, and no memories embedded in the walls. I planted a garden that first spring, not just herbs this time, but vegetables and flowers. Things that required care but gave back in equal measure. My work at the Historical Society had evolved into a full-time position as education coordinator. I developed programs for local schools, teaching children about the mining history of the region, the indigenous peoples who had lived there first, the environmental impact of human settlement. It wasn't the prestigious academic career I had once imagined, but it fed the same hunger for knowledge, for connection to the past. One afternoon, as I was closing up the museum, a man approached the information desk. He had salt and pepper hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "I'm hoping you can help me," he said, placing a faded photograph on the counter. "My grandfather worked in the Silver Creek mine around 1910. I'm trying to find any records you might have." His name was Robert. He was a professor of geology at a university in California, visiting the area to research a book about mining techniques in the early 20th century. I showed him our archives, helped him locate employee records from Silver Creek. He stayed until closing time, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked if I knew any good places for dinner. We ended up at my favorite cafe, talking not just about mining history but books, music, the way certain landscapes can feel like home even if you weren't born there. He had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. "Some days I still reach for her in the morning before I remember," he said, without self-pity. "But lately, I've been thinking it might be time to learn how to live again." I didn't tell him my whole story that night. Just that I had moved to Colorado for a fresh start. That I had family back east but we weren't in touch. He didn't push for more. Instead, he talked about the stars, how different they looked in the mountains compared to the city lights of San Francisco. We exchanged email addresses. Professional courtesy, we both pretended. He sent the first message 3 days later, a thank you for the help with his research. I responded with additional information I had found after he left. Soon we were writing daily, not just about history or geology, but about the books we were reading, the trails I had hiked, the students who frustrated him, the exhibits I was planning. He came back to Colorado a month later, ostensibly for more research. We had dinner again, then breakfast the next morning. He asked if I would show him the hiking trail I had mentioned in my emails. We spent the day walking through pine forests, stopping to identify wildflowers, talking about everything and nothing. When he left this time, he kissed me goodbye. Not passionately, not dramatically, just a gentle press of lips that held more question than demand. I found myself smiling after his car disappeared down the mountain road. At 43, I wasn't looking for romance or companionship. But perhaps that was why it found me, because I wasn't desperately seeking to fill an emptiness. Robert's visits became regular, once a month at first, then every other weekend. We took things slowly, both of us carrying our own histories, neither wanting to rush into something that might not heal properly if forced. He never pressured me to talk about my family, but gradually, over firelit evenings and long drives through mountain passes, I shared pieces of my past. "They took everything," I told him one night as we sat on my porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the valley. "Not just the inheritance, but years of my life I'll never get back." Robert was quiet for a long time, just holding my hand as lightning illuminated the clouds. Finally, he said, "Some people don't understand that love isn't the same as ownership." In the autumn, an envelope arrived with a California postmark. I recognized James's handwriting immediately. For a moment, I considered returning it unopened. Instead, I placed it on my kitchen counter and went about my day, teaching a class of 4th graders about fossil formation, having lunch with a colleague, stopping at the grocery store for fresh bread and coffee. The envelope was still there. When I returned, innocuous yet somehow pulsing with the past. I opened it after dinner, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine for courage. Inside was a formal invitation to a memorial service. Mom had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Heart failure, according to the brief note James had included. The service was scheduled for the following Saturday. The reception would be held at the house, Mom's house, James had written, though legally it had been his for over a year. There was no explicit request for me to attend, just the details and a phone number to RSVP. No apology, no acknowledgement of the silence between us, just the assumption that blood would trump everything that had happened. I placed the invitation in my desk drawer and didn't respond. That night, I dreamed of the old house, of doors that wouldn't open, of rooms that kept shifting and changing as I tried to navigate them. I woke feeling unsettled but certain, I would not go back. Not for a memorial service, not to comfort James. Not to maintain appearances for people whose opinions had never protected me. When I told Robert about the invitation, he nodded thoughtfully. "What would it give you to go?" he asked. Not, "Should you go," or "Don't you think you should?" Just a simple question about what I might gain. I considered it honestly. Closure? I had found that on my own. Reconciliation with James? Too little, too late. A chance to say goodbye to Mom? I had done that the day I drove away. Nothing, I finally answered. It would give me nothing I don't already have. Robert smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes. "Then there's your answer." That weekend, instead of attending a funeral in a town I had left behind, we drove to a national park and hiked to a waterfall. I felt sad for the complicated woman my mother had been, for the relationship we never managed to build. But I didn't feel guilty. That was the difference, the absence of guilt had become the presence of peace. 3 months later, another envelope arrived. This one was larger, a manila envelope with a law firm's return address stamped in the corner. Inside was a letter from a lawyer I didn't recognize, explaining that he was handling some final matters related to my mother's estate. There were documents requiring my signature, acknowledging that I made no claim on any remaining assets. I signed the papers without hesitation. I had no interest in fighting for what should have been freely given. I returned them in the provided envelope and considered the matter closed. A week later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Something made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. Sarah? It's Jonathan Mercer. I was your father's attorney before I retired. The voice was elderly but clear. I've been traveling abroad, just returned to find out about your mother's passing. There's something you should know. My heart quickened slightly. I'm listening, I said, sitting down at my kitchen table. Your father came to see me shortly before he transferred his legal matters to Mr. Bennett. He was concerned about some changes your mother wanted to make to their will. He didn't agree with them, but he was ill, tired of fighting. So he created a separate arrangement. Mr. Mercer paused. I understand you received a safety deposit box key? Yes, I confirmed, glancing at the emerald ring on my finger. That was part of it, but not all, he continued. Your father purchased a life insurance policy naming you as the sole beneficiary. It was set up through my office to ensure your mother wouldn't discover it. The documents were to be delivered 6 months after your mother's passing. I gripped the phone tighter. Why are you telling me this now? Mr. Mercer sighed. Because James has been making inquiries about your father's finances, reviewing old records. He found a reference to the policy but not the details. I wanted you to be prepared. The policy is substantial, $500,000. Your father wanted to make things right, in his own way. After we hung up, I sat in silence, watching the afternoon light change across my living room floor. I wasn't sure what I felt. Not vindication, exactly. Not triumph. Perhaps just a sad recognition that my father had understood the injustice but hadn't been strong enough to confront it directly. He had created a secret legacy instead of standing up for me when it mattered. The next day, James called. I let it ring through to voicemail. His message was terse, businesslike. Sarah, we need to talk about Dad's life insurance policy. Call me back. I didn't. 3 days later, he called again. This time, I answered. I'm not discussing this with you, James, I said before he could speak. The policy is mine. Dad wanted it that way. It's not fair, he said, his voice tight with the indignation of someone unaccustomed to not getting his way. You walked away. You abandoned Mom when she needed you. Now you get $500,000? For what? I almost laughed at the irony. For exactly that, James. For walking away when I had nothing else to give. For finding the strength to save myself. I'm contesting it, he said flatly. My lawyer says I have grounds based on Mom's diminished capacity when she signed the revised will. Dad clearly wasn't thinking clearly either. I took a deep breath. Contest it if you want. Spend your inheritance on legal fees. But ask yourself this: if Dad went to such lengths to keep this from Mom, to ensure I received something after being written out of the will, what does that tell you about what really happened? The line went quiet. I could almost hear him calculating, weighing options, costs, potential outcomes. James had always been practical above all else. Finally, he said, I have the house. The investments. I don't need the money. But it's the principle. I felt a calmness settle over me. No, James. It's not principle. It's pride. You can't stand that Dad did something you didn't control. That he saw me when you and Mom tried to make me invisible. When Robert came over that evening, I told him about the insurance policy, about James's threat to contest it. He listened carefully, then asked, what will you do if he follows through? I considered the question. Defend what's mine, I said simply. Not because I need the money, but because Dad wanted me to have it. It's the last thing he gave me. I won't let James take that too. The expected legal notice never came. Instead, 2 weeks later, a formal letter arrived from James's attorney stating that he would not contest the policy and acknowledging my right to the proceeds. No personal note from James, no apology, just a legal surrender. It was the closest thing to vindication I would ever receive from my brother. The insurance money arrived a month later. I put most of it in savings, donated some to the Historical Society for a new educational program, and used a small portion to take Robert to Italy, a trip I had dreamed about since my undergraduate days studying Renaissance art. We walked through ancient streets, ate gelato and sun-drenched piazzas, and traced the footsteps of history with our fingertips against stone walls that had stood for centuries. In Florence, standing before Botticelli's Primavera, Robert took my hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes on the painting rather than me. "My sabbatical ends in 3 months. I need to go back to California." My heart sank slightly. Though I had known this was coming. Long-distance relationships rarely survived reality. "But," he continued, still studying the dancing figures in the painting, "I've been offered a position at Colorado State. It would mean a pay cut, smaller department. But it would also mean being here. With you. If that's something you might want." I turned to look at him, this kind man who had entered my life when I wasn't looking, who asked questions instead of making assumptions. "I might want that very much," I said carefully. "But I need you to understand something. I spent most of my life being needed, being useful, being the one who stayed. I can't be that person again. Not even for someone I care about." Robert finally looked at me, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "I'm not asking you to be useful, Sarah. I'm asking if we could build something together. As equals. Both choosing, every day." We were married the following spring in a small ceremony. Beside the lake near my cabin. My colleagues from the Historical Society came. Robert's daughter flew in from New York with her husband and their new baby. A few friends I had made in Colorado stood witness. No one from my past was there, by choice rather than oversight. I kept my name. I kept my cabin, though we decided to live primarily at the house Robert purchased closer to the university. I maintained my position at the Historical Society, eventually becoming its director. We built a life of shared books and separate workspaces, of travels planned together and occasional weekends apart when one of us needed solitude. It wasn't perfect. We argued about small things, his tendency to leave coffee cups in his office. For days, my habit of staying up too late reading. We navigated the complexity of becoming a stepmother to an adult daughter, of integrating our separate lives into something shared but not merged. There were evenings when the past would resurface. Unexpectedly, a familiar song on the radio, a phrase that echoed something Mom once said, and I would grow quiet, remembering. But those moments became less frequent, less powerful. The past remained the past, a country I had left behind whose borders I no longer felt compelled to cross. I had learned that forgiveness wasn't necessary for healing. Some wounds didn't need to be revisited to be survived. 3 years after our wedding, a package arrived at my office. The return address was unfamiliar, but the postmark was from my hometown. Inside was a small wooden box, clearly old, with intricate carving around the edges. A note was taped to the top, "Found this in the attic when we bought the house. The realtor said it might belong to you." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a collection of small treasures, my high school graduation tassel, a pressed flower. From some forgotten special occasion, a small stack of cards tied with faded ribbon. I recognized my handwriting on the envelopes, birthday cards I had made for Dad over the years. He had kept them, hidden them away where Mom wouldn't find them. At the bottom of the box was a photograph I had never seen before. Me at perhaps 7 or 8, sitting on Dad's shoulders at what appeared to be a county fair. Both of us were laughing, my hands gripping his forehead, his arms secure around my legs. On the back, in Dad's handwriting, "Sarah's first Ferris wheel ride. She was scared but did it anyway. My brave girl." I traced the words with my fingertip, feeling something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Dad had loved me in his way, trapped in a marriage and a life that left little room for standing up against the tide. He had failed me in the big moments but tried to love me in the small ones. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something real amid all the hurt. I placed the photo in a drawer at home rather than displaying it. The past didn't need to be visible to be acknowledged. That evening, sitting on the porch with Robert, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I told him about the box, about the photo, about the complicated man my father had been. "Do you wish things had been different?" Robert asked, his hand warm around mine. I considered the question carefully, watching an eagle soar across the valley. "Yes," I finally said. "But not in the way you might think. I don't wish he had fought harder for me, though that would have been nice. I wish he had taught me earlier that it was okay to fight for myself." Robert nodded, understanding. "And now?" I smiled, not the polite smile I had perfected in my previous life, but the real one that came easily these days. "Now I know that some inheritances aren't written in wills or kept in safety deposit boxes. Some we have to claim for ourselves. The courage to walk away. The strength to build something new. The wisdom to recognize when staying costs too much." As the last light faded from the sky, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with money or property or even family. I had inherited my father's capacity for love, his appreciation for history, his resilience. I had also inherited my mother's determination, though I had chosen to use it differently. From both of them, I had learned what kind of person I didn't want to be. That, too, was a valuable legacy. The second envelope that appeared at the will reading hadn't just given me financial freedom. It had given me permission to believe there was more to my story than sacrifice. That sometimes the bravest choice isn't staying but leaving. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to write your own ending, even when others try to dictate the final page. 5 years into my new life, I received an unexpected email from a literary agent in New York. She had visited our historical society during a vacation in Colorado and had been impressed by the exhibit I had curated about women in the mining industry. She was looking for authors to contribute to a book series about overlooked historical figures and wondered if I might be interested. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading and rereading her words. Once, long ago, I had dreamed of writing, not just museum placards or educational pamphlets, but real scholarship that might change how people understood the past. That dream had been packed away with so many others when I chose to stay with my parents, when that choice became a cage rather than a decision. "You should do it," Robert said when I showed him the email that evening. He was grading papers at the dining table, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "You have more knowledge about this region's history than anyone I know." I hesitated, the old doubts surfacing. It would mean research trips, interviews, time away from the museum, from home. Robert set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Sarah," he said gently, "are you asking for permission?" The question caught me off guard. Was I? Had I unconsciously slipped back into the pattern of seeking approval before pursuing what I wanted? "No," I said after a moment. "I'm not asking permission. I'm just thinking out loud." He smiled. "Good. Because you've never needed anyone's permission to shine." That night, I wrote back to the agent, expressing interest but also outlining my own vision for the project, focusing specifically on the immigrant women who had built communities around the mining operations, whose stories had been overshadowed by tales of male prospectors and industrial magnates. Within 6 months, I had signed a contract, taken a part-time sabbatical from the museum, and converted our guest room into a research office. The walls were covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. My desk overflowed with primary sources. Diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, the fragmentary evidence of lives once lived but nearly forgotten. I interviewed elderly residents whose grandmothers had come from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe to make homes in harsh mountain conditions. I visited historical archives in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco. I wrote in the early mornings, before sunrise and late into the evening after Robert had gone to bed, the words flowing with an urgency I hadn't felt in decades. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but deeply fulfilling. I wasn't just recording history, I was reclaiming voices that had been silenced, stories that paralleled my own in subtle ways. Women who had made difficult choices, who had sacrificed but also persevered, who had found ways to create meaning even when circumstances constrained their options. One afternoon, as I was reviewing transcripts from an interview with a 92-year-old woman whose mother had run a boarding house for miners, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code belonged to my hometown. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello? Is this Sarah Winters?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Rachel Donovan from County General Hospital. I'm calling because you're listed as the emergency contact for a James Winters. My brother." My heart quickened. "There must be some mistake," I said carefully. "I haven't been in contact with my brother for years." The woman paused. "Well, his information still lists you. Mr. Winters was admitted yesterday following a stroke. His condition is serious but stable. His wife is currently out of the country and difficult to reach. He's been asking for you." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the past pressing against the present. "I live in Colorado now. I can't just drop everything." "I understand," she said, her tone neutral. "I'll make a note in his file. Is there another family member we should contact?" The question hung in the air. Another family member. As if family were interchangeable parts, as if one relative could simply be substituted for another. "No," I finally said. "There's no one else. Just his wife, Caroline." After hanging up, I sat motionless at my desk, staring at the research materials spread before me without really seeing them. James had a stroke. James was asking for me. James still had me listed as his emergency contact after all these years of silence. I didn't know what to make of any of it. That evening, I told Robert about the call. He listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. When I finished, he asked, "What are you thinking?" Not, "What are you going to do," or "You should," or "You shouldn't." Just a simple question about my thoughts, giving me space to process without pressure. I'm thinking that it's ironic, I said, pouring myself a glass of wine. He needs someone. Now, and suddenly I exist again. Robert nodded. That's fair. What else? I took a sip, considering. I'm thinking that I don't owe him anything. That going back would be reopening wounds that have finally healed. Another nod. And? I set down my glass. And I'm thinking about how small he must feel in that hospital bed. How frightening it must be to face mortality alone. I remember that feeling from when I had my appendix out. No one came to visit. Except a neighbor who brought the wrong magazines. The memory was vivid, the sterile room, the silence, the painful awareness that there was no one who would drop everything to be by my side. If you want to go, I'll support you, Robert said. If you don't, I'll support that too. This isn't about what you owe him. It's about what kind of person you want to be. I looked at my husband, this wise man who understood that some decisions aren't about right or wrong but about who we are at our core. The next morning, I booked a flight. Not because I had forgiven James or forgotten the past, but because compassion doesn't require either. I packed light, just enough for 3 days. I wasn't moving back into my old role as family caretaker. I was visiting a sick man who happened to share my blood, setting my own boundaries for what that meant. The flight was smooth, the rental car generic, the drive to the hospital a strange journey through a landscape both familiar and foreign. Streets I had once known intimately now held new buildings, different businesses. The town had changed in my absence, or perhaps I was simply seeing it through new eyes. James looked smaller in the hospital bed than I remembered him, his face ashen, one side slightly drooping. His hair had gone completely gray. For a moment, I saw our father in his features, the same determined set to his jaw even in illness. He didn't notice me enter the room, his gaze fixed on the television mounted on the wall. James, I said quietly, standing at the foot of the bed. He turned slowly, his eyes widening with recognition. Sarah, he said, his voice slurred but clear enough. You came. I nodded, moving to sit in the chair beside the bed. The hospital called me. How are you feeling? A simple question, clinical almost, but genuine. Like hell, he admitted. Can't feel my left side properly. Doctor says I'm lucky it wasn't worse. There was an awkward pause. 5 years of silence stretched between us like a chasm neither knew how to bridge. Finally, he said, Caroline's in Europe. Business trip. They're trying to reach her. I nodded again. The nurse mentioned that. Have they contacted your children? James looked away. Michael's in Japan with the military. Elizabeth is in her residency, can't get away. Thomas. He hesitated. Thomas and I haven't spoken in 2 years. Some disagreement about his career choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. James, who had once judged me for walking away from family obligation, now estranged from his own son. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone. James made a dismissive gesture with his right hand. He'll come around eventually. Family is family. I didn't argue, though I could have pointed out the hypocrisy. Instead, I asked practical questions about his treatment, his prognosis, his discharge plan. He answered mechanically, the conversation safe in its focus on medical details rather than emotional terrain. As I was preparing to leave, promising to return the next day, he suddenly reached for my hand. Why did you come? He asked, his voice vulnerable in a way I had never heard before. After everything, why would you bother? I looked at him, this man who had taken what should have been mine, who had expected me to sacrifice without recognition, who had never once acknowledged the injustice at the heart of our family. Because no one should be alone in a hospital, I said simply. Not even you. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just humanity, offered without expectation. I saw something shift in his eyes, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing me as a person with choices rather than a role to fulfill. I stayed for the promised 3 days. I brought James books to read, helped him navigate hospital meals, sat with him during physical therapy sessions where he struggled to relearn basic movements. We didn't speak of the past. We didn't try to repair what had been broken. We existed in a present defined by his immediate needs and my chosen limitations. On the 3rd day, as I was preparing to leave for the airport, James asked, could you stay longer? Just until Caroline gets back. The doctor says I can go home tomorrow. But I'll need help. I looked at him steadily. No, James. I can't. I have commitments in Colorado, my job, my husband, my life. I came because you needed someone in an emergency, not to become your caretaker. He frowned, the old entitlement surfacing. But who will help me if you don't? I shouldered my bag, standing firm. You'll need to figure that out. There are home health services. You can hire someone. You have the resources. My voice was kind but resolute. I helped because I chose to, not because I was obligated. There's a difference. As I turned to leave, he called after me, Sarah. I paused at the door. I never thanked you for all those years with Mom and Dad. I should have. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of the inheritance that should have been shared. But it was something, a small crack in the wall of justification he had built around his actions. No, I agreed. You never did. I didn't say it was okay. I didn't say I forgave him. I simply acknowledged the truth we both knew. Sometimes recognition is enough, even without absolution. I left the hospital with a lighter step than I had entered it, not because the past had been erased but because I had faced it on my terms. When I returned to Colorado, I threw myself back into my research with renewed energy. The experience with James had clarified something important, the difference between choosing to help and being expected to sacrifice. The women I was writing about had navigated similar tensions, finding ways to care for others while preserving their own dignity and dreams. My book, Bedrock, The Forgotten Women Who Built the West, was published 18 months later to positive reviews and modest sales. I hadn't written a bestseller, but I had created something meaningful, something that honored voices that might otherwise have been lost to history. At the book launch at our local bookstore, Robert presented me with a framed copy of the cover. "To new beginnings," he said, raising a glass of champagne. The small crowd of friends and colleagues echoed the toast. I looked around at the faces of people who knew me as I was now, author, historian, museum director, wife, not as I had been. People who had never expected me to diminish myself for their convenience. The contrast was startling in its simplicity. A week after the book launch, I received an email from James. We had exchanged occasional messages since his stroke, brief, superficial updates rather than deep communication. This one was different. "I read your book," he wrote. "Ordered it online. It's good, Sarah. Really good. Dad would have been proud." The message included a photo of the book on his coffee table, evidence that he wasn't just saying what he thought. I wanted to hear. I sat with the email for a while before responding. This wasn't about forgiveness or rebuilding a relationship that had never been healthy. It was about acknowledging that people can grow, can see things differently with time and distance. "Thank you," I wrote back. "That means something to me." Simple, honest, bounded. That spring, I was invited to give a lecture at a university in California. During the question and answer session afterward, a young woman raised her hand. "Your book talks about women who made difficult choices in constraining circumstances," she said. "What advice would you give to someone who feels trapped between family obligations and personal ambition today?" I considered the question carefully. "I would say that the dichotomy is often false," I answered. "We're taught to believe that caring for others and caring for ourselves are mutually exclusive, that we must choose one or the other. But the healthiest relationships are those where both are possible, where sacrifice is freely chosen rather than coerced, where it flows in multiple directions rather than always from the same person." The young woman nodded, writing something in her notebook. "And if that's not possible," she pressed. "If the family dynamic is unhealthy?" I thought of my parents, of James, of the years I had spent trying to earn love through usefulness. Then I would say that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and ultimately for others, is to break the pattern. To walk away. To build a life where mutual respect is the foundation, not obligation. After the lecture, the young woman approached me, introducing herself as a graduate student researching family systems. "Your answer resonated with me," she said. "I've been caring for my grandmother with dementia while trying to finish my dissertation. My siblings rarely help, but they have plenty of opinions about how I should be doing more." I recognized the familiar pattern, the weight in her shoulders, the apologetic way she spoke about her own needs. "What's your dissertation about?" I asked. Her face lit up as she described her research on resilience in immigrant communities, the passion clear in her voice. "It sounds fascinating," I said sincerely. "And important." She smiled, then sighed. "My advisor says I should be finished by now, but with Grandma's care." I nodded, understanding. "Have you considered that there might be other options for your grandmother's care? Options that would allow you to complete your work without abandoning her?" She looked startled, as if the possibility had never occurred to her. "Like what?" she asked hesitantly. I shared some resources, elder care services, respite programs, ways to involve reluctant family members through concrete, scheduled commitments rather than vague promises of help. "The point isn't to walk away completely," I explained. "It's to create boundaries that allow you to fulfill your purpose without being consumed by others' needs." As we parted, she thanked me with tears in her eyes. I thought I was being selfish. For wanting to finish my degree, she admitted. For wanting something that was just mine. I squeezed her hand. Wanting to contribute your gifts to the world isn't selfish, I said. It's necessary. We don't help anyone by making ourselves smaller. On the flight home, I thought about that conversation, about how easily we internalize the belief that our worth is measured by what we give up rather than what we create. I had lived half my life under that illusion, seeing sacrifice as the highest virtue, confusing love with erasure. The truth had come late, but it had come, that love should expand us, not diminish us. When I arrived home, there was a package waiting on the porch. No return address, just my name and address in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a small wooden chest, intricately carved with flowers and vines. Nestled within it was a collection of old photographs I had never seen before, images of my father as a young man, smiling, vital, standing beside a motorcycle with mountains in the background. A note was tucked among the photographs, written in a shaky hand I didn't recognize. Dear Ms. Winters, my name is Eleanor Finch. I was friends with your father in college, before he met your mother. While cleaning out my attic, I found these photos and thought you might want them. Daniel always spoke of wanting to travel, to see the world. He was quite an adventurer in those days. I often wondered what happened to that spirited young man. I spread the photos across my desk, studying the face of someone I had never really known. My father, before obligation and compromise had reshaped him, before he had made choices that narrowed rather than expanded his life. In one image, he stood atop a mountain peak, arms outstretched, face tilted toward the sun. On the back, in his youthful handwriting, freedom tastes like mountain air. Colorado, 1962. Colorado. The same mountains where I had found my own freedom decades later. The coincidence felt significant, as if some essential part of him had somehow guided me here, to the place where he had once felt most alive. I wondered if he had remembered that feeling in his final years, if he had recognized in me the same hunger for open skies and possibility. That evening, I added the photos to the small collection of mementos I kept in a cedar box, not displayed prominently, but preserved nonetheless. The past didn't define me anymore, but it remained a part of the complex tapestry that had brought me to this moment, to this life I had built from choices rather than obligations. As I closed the box, I thought about inheritance, not of money or property, but of spirit. Perhaps my father had given me something valuable after all, something that couldn't be written into a will or contested by others. A capacity for resilience, a quiet determination, a desire for something more. And in his final act, the secret insurance policy, the hidden safety deposit box, perhaps he had been trying to pass on the courage he had never fully claimed for himself. The second envelope that appeared at the will reading hadn't just contained financial freedom. It had contained permission, to walk away, to begin again, to choose myself when no one else would. That permission had come too late for my father. But not for me. Not for the woman I had become, the woman who now helped others find their own path to freedom without shame. 10 years after leaving my hometown, I received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference in Chicago. The organizer had read my book and wanted me to discuss how understanding history could empower women to make difficult choices in the present. The timing was perfect. Robert would be at an academic conference that week, and I had just completed a major exhibit at the museum. As I packed for the trip, I realized this would be my first visit to Chicago since I had received that scholarship letter decades ago. The city that might have been my home if circumstances had been different. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and nostalgia for a life I had never actually lived, for the young woman with dreams of academia who had been told to stay put. The conference was held in a gleaming hotel downtown, with views of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. My session was scheduled for the second day, but I arrived early to attend other presentations and get a feel for the audience. The women I met were diverse in age and background, corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs, academics, but they shared a common hunger for authenticity and purpose. My talk, titled Reclaiming Your Story, Lessons from Women Who Refuse to Be Footnotes, drew from both my historical research and my personal experience, though I kept the latter subtle, woven through my analysis rather than explicitly stated. I spoke about the immigrant women who had built communities in harsh mining towns, who had found ways to preserve their identities even when circumstances demanded compromise. These women teach us something essential, I concluded, looking out at the attentive faces. I made you responsible for my fears. That was wrong. The house should have been yours. I'm sorry it's too late to fix what I broke. Mom. I sat with the letter for a long time, emotions washing through me in waves, anger, sadness, a complicated grief for what might have been. This wasn't the dramatic apology of movies, the deathbed reconciliation that erases decades of hurt. It was small, inadequate, human. An acknowledgement that came too late to change the relationship but perhaps just in time to inform how I wrote about it. I added a chapter to the manuscript, exploring the complex legacy of my mother's fears, how they had shaped both her actions and my responses. Not excusing the harm she had caused, but contextualizing it, seeing her as a whole person rather than simply the obstacle to my freedom. It was the most difficult chapter to write, but perhaps the most important, moving beyond the simple narrative of victim and villain to something more nuanced and ultimately more healing. When the manuscript was complete, I sent it to Jessica with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Putting these words into the world felt both vulnerable and powerful, exposing my wounds but also claiming my story on my own terms. The editorial process was collaborative, respectful of both the emotional content and the scholarly framework I had created. As publication approached, I received another unexpected communication, an invitation to give a keynote address at a conference in my hometown. The topic was Women's Leadership in Regional Historical Preservation, perfectly aligned with my professional expertise. Under normal circumstances, I might have declined, unwilling to return to a place that held so many difficult memories. This time, I accepted. Not because I had forgotten or forgiven everything, but because I no longer needed to avoid the past. To protect myself from it. I had integrated those experiences into a larger narrative that belonged to me, not to those who had tried to write me out of the story. Returning now would be from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The conference was scheduled for 2 weeks after my book's release. Robert offered to accompany me, but I decided to go alone. This was a journey I needed to make on my terms, a final reclaiming of spaces that had once felt constricting. I booked a hotel rather than staying with James, maintaining the boundaries that had served me well. My book, The Second Envelope, Reclaiming Your Story When Others Try to Write You Out, was released with thoughtful reviews and strong initial sales. The publisher had arranged a small promotional tour, including a signing at a bookstore in my hometown the evening before the conference. I arrived with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, wondering how it would feel to be publicly myself in a place where I had spent so many years being what others needed. The bookstore was more crowded than I expected, filled with women of various ages, some familiar faces from my past life, others complete strangers. I read a short passage from the book, the scene at the will reading when Mom had smiled and said, "You don't need anything else. You had time with your father. That was your share." Then I described finding the second envelope, the key to the safety deposit box, the revelation that Dad had tried, in his limited way, to acknowledge what had been taken from me. During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand. "Did writing this book help you forgive your family?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, aware of the expectation embedded within it, that forgiveness is the necessary conclusion to any story of harm or neglect. "I've come to believe that forgiveness isn't always the point," I answered honestly. "Sometimes understanding is enough, seeing clearly what happened, why it happened, how it shaped you. I understand my parents and brother better now. I can see the fears and limitations they were operating within. That understanding has freed me from anger, but I don't need to call it forgiveness to move forward." The woman nodded slowly, something in her expression suggesting this perspective was new and perhaps liberating. After the formal event ended, several people approached for more personal conversations. One older woman waited until the others had dispersed. "I was friends with your mother," she said quietly. "I always wondered what happened to you after you left. She wasn't the same afterward." I tensed slightly, preparing for defense of my mother or criticism of my choices. Instead, the woman continued, "I want you to know that she regretted what happened with the will. She talked about it near the end. Said it was the biggest mistake of her life." I nodded, neither accepting this as absolution nor rejecting it as irrelevant. "Thank you for telling me," I said simply. As I signed the last books and prepared to leave, I noticed James standing near the back of the store, a copy of my book in his hands. Our eyes met across the room. He didn't approach, and I didn't wave him over. Instead, he gave a small nod that somehow contained acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even a hint of pride. I returned the gesture, a silent exchange that required no words. The following morning, I delivered my keynote address to a packed conference room. I spoke about the importance of preserving women's historical contributions, about the power of recognizing that history is always more complex than the dominant narrative suggests. I didn't reference my personal story explicitly, keeping the focus professional, but I knew that many in the audience had attended the bookstore event or read my memoir. Afterward, walking through the familiar streets of my hometown, I felt a strange sense of peace. This place no longer held power over me. It was simply a location, one chapter in a much longer story that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. I had come back not as the dutiful daughter seeking approval, but as the author of my own life, claiming space on my own terms. That evening, I called Robert from my hotel room. "How does it feel to be back?" he asked. I considered the question, looking out the window at the town where I had spent the first 42 years of my life. "Like visiting a place I've read about but don't quite remember," I answered truthfully. "Familiar but distant." "Are you glad you went?" His voice was warm, curious without being directive. I smiled, grateful once again for this partnership built on respect rather than expectation. "Yes," I said. "Not because anything was resolved or redeemed, but because I didn't need it to be. That's the real freedom, not needing the story to end a certain way to be okay." As I prepared for bed, I thought about the second envelope. That had appeared at the will reading all those years ago. At the time, it had seemed like a small consolation, an insufficient attempt to balance scales that had been tipped against me for decades. Now I understood it had been something more significant, the key that unlocked a door I might never have found the courage to open otherwise. The inheritance that mattered hadn't been the house or the money. It had been the permission to walk away, to start again, to believe I deserved more than what had been allocated to me by others. That permission had come in the form of a literal key to a safety deposit box, but its true value had been symbolic, the recognition that my story belonged to me, that I had the right to write my own ending. As I drifted toward sleep in a town I had once been desperate to escape, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Just a quiet certainty that the life I had built from choice rather than obligation was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because fate or destiny had led me there, but because I had found the courage to lead myself, one step at a time, toward a future I had dared to imagine. The second envelope hadn't just contained an inheritance. It had contained possibility. The possibility that we can begin again at any age, that we can reclaim what was taken, that we can become authors rather than footnotes in our own stories. That possibility was the true legacy I had received, one that no one could take away. Because it lived not in property or possessions, but in the choices I continued to make each day. 15 years after walking away from my hometown, I found myself in an unexpected position, standing behind a podium at a women's empowerment conference in New York, introduced as a keynote speaker. The success of my memoir had led to speaking engagements across the country, opportunities to share the message that had resonated with so many women, that it's never too late to reclaim your story. The audience of 800 women and a scattering of men looked back at me with expectant faces. Some held copies of my book, dog-eared and highlighted. Others were taking notes on tablets or in journals. All were seeking something: permission, inspiration, practical guidance for navigating their own crossroads. When I was 42, I thought my story was finished. I believed the narrative had been written for me, dutiful daughter, family caretaker, the one who stayed behind while others moved forward. I had accepted my role as a supporting character in other people's lives. I paused, looking out at the sea of attentive faces. Then came the will reading that changed everything. The moment when my mother smiled and said, "She gets nothing." And in that devastating moment, when I felt most erased, most invisible, a second envelope appeared that would ultimately lead me not just to financial independence, but to a fundamental truth: we are not supporting characters. We are the protagonists of our own lives. The speech flowed from there, not a rehearsed script but a genuine sharing of the journey I had taken from that moment in the attorney's office to the stage in New York. I spoke about the safety deposit box, about building a new life in Colorado, about finding love with Robert, about writing my first book on women in mining communities, and finally about the memoir that had connected my story to so many others. The most important thing I've learned, I concluded, is that reclaiming your story isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a daily practice of making choices that honor your worth, of recognizing when you're slipping back into old patterns of self-erasure, of surrounding yourself with people who see you as the main character you are. The applause was warm, affirming. As I stepped away from the podium, a woman in the front row caught my eye. She couldn't have been more than 30, with bright eyes and a determined set to her jaw that reminded me of myself at a younger age. She was the first to approach during the book signing that followed. "Your book saved my life," she said without preamble, placing her well-worn copy on the table. "I was taking care of my father with Alzheimer's, putting my own dreams on hold. Because my brother said it was my responsibility as the unmarried daughter. I was slowly disappearing." She took a deep breath. "Then I read about your second envelope, about how you walked away and built something new. It gave me courage." "What did you do?" I asked, genuinely curious about how my story had intersected with hers. She smiled, a flash of pride breaking through her serious demeanor. "I found a memory care facility that was actually better for Dad than my amateur caregiving. I went back to law school. I set boundaries with my brother for the first time in my life. He didn't like it, but he's adjusting." I signed her book with a personal message, thanking her for sharing her story with me. As she walked away, another woman took her place, then another and another. Each had a variation of the same theme: lives put on hold, dreams deferred, identity subsumed by others' expectations. Each had found in my story not an exact template but a permission slip to imagine alternatives. By the time the signing ended, my hand was cramped but my spirit was soaring. This was why I had ultimately decided to share my story publicly, not for validation or attention, but for the connections it created, the possibility it awakened in others. The personal had become universal, my specific experience a doorway through which others could walk toward their own liberation. That evening, I called Robert from my hotel room, my voice animated as I described the event. It was extraordinary. I told him. These women are doing such brave things, leaving abusive relationships, starting businesses in their 50s, setting boundaries with demanding families. And somehow my story helped give them permission. Because you showed that there's life after walking away, Robert said, his voice warm through the phone. You didn't just survive, you thrived. That's what makes your message powerful. It's not about escape, it's about creation. I smiled, grateful once again for this partner who saw me so clearly, who understood that my work wasn't about dwelling in the past but building toward a future where fewer women felt trapped by obligation. The following morning, I received an email from my publisher. My memoir had been selected for a prestigious book award, one that recognized works that contribute significantly to conversations about women's autonomy and self-determination. The ceremony would be held in 3 months in London. This is international recognition, Jessica wrote. Your message is resonating far beyond what we anticipated. I sat with the news, allowing myself to feel the fullness of what it meant. Not just professional validation, though that was certainly welcome, but evidence that the themes I had explored were universal, transcending cultural and geographical boundaries. Women everywhere were hungry for permission to prioritize themselves, to see their own needs as legitimate, to break generational patterns of sacrifice without reward. The day before flying home to Colorado, I had breakfast with a literary agent who had approached me after the keynote speech. Your story has struck a nerve, she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Publishers are interested in what comes next. Have you considered a follow-up book? I hadn't, honestly. The memoir had felt complete in itself, a contained narrative. With a natural conclusion. What would a second book explore? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. She leaned forward, her expression animated. The aftermath. What happens after women reclaim their stories? How do they build new lives on their own terms? How do they maintain boundaries when old patterns try to reassert themselves? Your readers want guidance for the next chapter. The idea resonated. Unexpectedly. My own journey hadn't ended with walking away from my hometown or even with publishing the memoir. There had been challenges along the way, moments of doubt, attempts by James to pull me back into old dynamics, the complex emotions of building a relationship with Robert that wasn't based on caretaking or obligation. Perhaps there was value in exploring that terrain. I'll think about it, I promised, and I did, all through the flight home, through the drive from the airport to the cabin Robert and I still maintained as a weekend retreat from our primary home near the university. By the time I arrived, a concept was taking shape. Not a simple sequel but a deeper exploration of what freedom requires of us once we've claimed it. When I shared the idea with Robert that evening, sitting on our porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, he nodded thoughtfully. It's needed, he said simply. Freedom is disorienting when you've lived so long without it. People need maps for that territory too. Over the next several months, as I prepared for the award ceremony in London, I began gathering material for this potential second book. I interviewed women who had read my memoir and made significant changes in their lives as a result. I spoke with therapists who specialized in helping people establish healthy boundaries after years of codependent relationships. I researched the neuroscience of habit formation and the psychology of identity reconstruction. The stories I collected were both heartbreaking and inspiring: women who had walked away from prestigious careers that were destroying their health, daughters who had limited contact with manipulative parents, wives who had renegotiated marriages that had become one-sided obligations. Each had faced the vertigo of freedom, the discomfort of setting boundaries, the guilt that accompanies prioritizing oneself after years of self-neglect. What emerged was a pattern. The hardest part wasn't making the initial break but maintaining the new reality when voices both external and internal pushed for regression to familiar patterns. One woman described it perfectly: walking away took courage, but staying away takes commitment. Every day I have to recommit to my own worth. The award ceremony in London was more elaborate than I had anticipated, a black tie affair at a historic venue, attended by authors, publishers, and advocates from around the world. Robert accompanied me, handsome in a rented tuxedo, his pride evident in the way he introduced himself to everyone we met. I'm Sarah's husband. Have you read her remarkable book? When my name was called, I approached the podium with a strange sense of calm. Looking out at the distinguished audience, I felt neither intimidated nor out of place. I belonged here, not because I had experienced unique hardship, but because I had found the courage to transform that experience into something meaningful for others. This award honors books that contribute to conversations about women's autonomy, I began. But the true conversation isn't happening on these pages. It's happening in living rooms and kitchens, in therapists' offices and coffee shops, wherever women gather to whisper the truth. I want more than this. I deserve more than this. And I'm scared to claim it. I spoke briefly about the hundreds of letters I had received from readers, about the common thread that ran through them all, the hunger for permission to prioritize their own needs, without being labeled selfish or cold. My story isn't exceptional, I concluded. What's exceptional is how many women have been waiting for permission to tell their own versions of it. This award belongs to all of them, to every woman finding the courage to become the author rather than the footnote of her life. The applause was enthusiastic, but what moved me most were the nods of recognition, the tears in some eyes, the way certain women in the audience reached for their companions' hands as if to say, "This is what I've been trying to tell you." The message was resonating across cultures and generations, touching something fundamental about human dignity and self-determination. After the ceremony, a distinguished-looking woman with silver hair approached me. She introduced herself as the head of a foundation that supported women's education and empowerment globally. "We've been following your work with interest," she said. "We'd like to discuss the possibility of creating a program based on your concepts, helping women in various cultural contexts reclaim their narratives and build lives of purpose." The conversation continued over breakfast the following morning, a detailed discussion of how the principles I had articulated might be adapted for women in different circumstances, from corporate executives facing glass ceilings to rural women constrained by tradition and economic dependency. My book, The Second Envelope, Reclaiming Your Story When Others Try to Write You Out, was released with thoughtful reviews and strong initial sales. The publisher had arranged a small promotional tour, including a signing at a bookstore in my hometown the evening before the conference. I arrived with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, wondering how it would feel to be publicly myself in a place where I had spent so many years being what others needed. The bookstore was more crowded than I expected, filled with women of various ages, some familiar faces from my past life, others complete strangers. I read a short passage from the book, the scene at the will reading when Mom had smiled and said, "You don't need anything else. You had time with your father. That was your share." Then I described finding the second envelope, the key to the safety deposit box, the revelation that Dad had tried, in his limited way, to acknowledge what had been taken from me. During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand. "Did writing this book help you forgive your family?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, aware of the expectation embedded within it, that forgiveness is the necessary conclusion to any story of harm or neglect. "I've come to believe that forgiveness isn't always the point," I answered honestly. "Sometimes understanding is enough, seeing clearly what happened, why it happened, how it shaped you. I understand my parents and brother better now. I can see the fears and limitations they were operating within. That understanding has freed me from anger, but I don't need to call it forgiveness to move forward." The woman nodded slowly, something in her expression suggesting this perspective was new and perhaps liberating. After the formal event ended, several people approached for more personal conversations. One older woman waited until the others had dispersed. "I was friends with your mother," she said quietly. "I always wondered what happened to you after you left. She wasn't the same afterward." I tensed slightly, preparing for defense of my mother or criticism of my choices. Instead, the woman continued, "I want you to know that she regretted what happened with the will. She talked about it near the end. Said it was the biggest mistake of her life." I nodded, neither accepting this as absolution nor rejecting it as irrelevant. "Thank you for telling me," I said simply. As I signed the last books and prepared to leave, I noticed James standing near the back of the store, a copy of my book in his hands. Our eyes met across the room. He didn't approach, and I didn't wave him over. Instead, he gave a small nod that somehow contained acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even a hint of pride. I returned the gesture, a silent exchange that required no words. The following morning, I delivered my keynote address to a packed conference room. I spoke about the importance of preserving women's historical contributions, about the power of recognizing that history is always more complex than the dominant narrative suggests. I didn't reference my personal story explicitly, keeping the focus professional, but I knew that many in the audience had attended the bookstore event or read my memoir. Afterward, walking through the familiar streets of my hometown, I felt a strange sense of peace. This place no longer held power over me. It was simply a location, one chapter in a much longer story that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. I had come back not as the dutiful daughter seeking approval, but as the author of my own life, claiming space on my own terms. That evening, I called Robert from my hotel room. "How does it feel to be back?" he asked. I considered the question, looking out the window at the town where I had spent the first 42 years of my life. "Like visiting a place I've read about but don't quite remember," I answered truthfully. "Familiar but distant." "Are you glad you went?" His voice was warm, curious without being directive. I smiled, grateful once again for this partnership built on respect rather than expectation. "Yes," I said. Not because anything was resolved or redeemed, but because I didn't need it to be. That's the real freedom, not needing the story to end a certain way to be okay. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the second envelope. That had appeared at the will reading all those years ago. At the time, it had seemed like a small consolation, an insufficient attempt to balance scales that had been tipped against me for decades. Now I understood it had been something more significant, the key that unlocked a door I might never have found the courage to open otherwise. The inheritance that mattered hadn't been the house or the money. It had been the permission to walk away, to start again, to believe I deserved more than what had been allocated to me by others. That permission had come in the form of a literal key to a safety deposit box, but its true value had been symbolic, the recognition that my story belonged to me, that I had the right to write my own ending. As I drifted toward sleep in a town I had once been desperate to escape, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Just a quiet certainty that the life I had built from choice rather than obligation was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because fate or destiny had led me there, but because I had found the courage to lead myself, one step at a time, toward a future I had dared to imagine. The second envelope hadn't just contained an inheritance. It had contained possibility. The possibility that we can begin again at any age, that we can reclaim what was taken, that we can become authors rather than footnotes in our own stories. That possibility was the true legacy I had received, one that no one could take away. Because it lived not in property or possessions, but in the choices I continued to make each day. 15 years after walking away from my hometown, I found myself in an unexpected position, standing behind a podium at a women's empowerment conference in New York, introduced as a keynote speaker. The success of my memoir had led to speaking engagements across the country, opportunities to share the message that had resonated with so many women, that it's never too late to reclaim your story. The audience of 800 women and a scattering of men looked back at me with expectant faces. Some held copies of my book, dog-eared and highlighted. Others were taking notes on tablets or in journals. All were seeking something: permission, inspiration, practical guidance for navigating their own crossroads. When I was 42, I thought my story was finished. I believed the narrative had been written for me, dutiful daughter, family caretaker, the one who stayed behind while others moved forward. I had accepted my role as a supporting character in other people's lives. I paused, looking out at the sea of attentive faces. Then came the will reading that changed everything. The moment when my mother smiled and said, "She gets nothing." And in that devastating moment, when I felt most erased, most invisible, a second envelope appeared that would ultimately lead me not just to financial independence, but to a fundamental truth: we are not supporting characters. We are the protagonists of our own lives. The speech flowed from there, not a rehearsed script but a genuine sharing of the journey I had taken from that moment in the attorney's office to the stage in New York. I spoke about the safety deposit box, about building a new life in Colorado, about finding love with Robert, about writing my first book on women in mining communities, and finally about the memoir that had connected my story to so many others. The most important thing I've learned, I concluded, is that reclaiming your story isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a daily practice of making choices that honor your worth, of recognizing when you're slipping back into old patterns of self-erasure, of surrounding yourself with people who see you as the main character you are. The applause was warm, affirming. As I stepped away from the podium, a woman in the front row caught my eye. She couldn't have been more than 30, with bright eyes and a determined set to her jaw that reminded me of myself at a younger age. She was the first to approach during the book signing that followed. "Your book saved my life," she said without preamble, placing her well-worn copy on the table. "I was taking care of my father with Alzheimer's, putting my own dreams on hold. Because my brother said it was my responsibility as the unmarried daughter. I was slowly disappearing." She took a deep breath. "Then I read about your second envelope, about how you walked away and built something new. It gave me courage." "What did you do?" I asked, genuinely curious about how my story had intersected with hers. She smiled, a flash of pride breaking through her serious demeanor. "I found a memory care facility that was actually better for Dad than my amateur caregiving. I went back to law school." I set boundaries with my brother for the first time in my life. He didn't like it, but he's adjusting. I signed her book with a personal message, thanking her for sharing her story with me. As she walked away, another woman took her place, then another and another. Each had a variation of the same theme: lives put on hold, dreams deferred, identity subsumed by others' expectations. Each had found in my story not an exact template but a permission slip to imagine alternatives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.